No.
Great. Welcome, everyone. Today is the second installment of our UWGB Summer Series, Technology in Context. Today, we will be talking about artificial intelligence. I have given this class many times, and it used to be called Understanding AI Like Never Before. I've changed the concept a little bit for today to get you more engaged and drawn in. Let me introduce myself. My name is Oliver Buechse. I am a strategist, and I have shifted my focus towards digital transformation in the last years. I believe it's one of the most relevant topics of our times. I have the privilege of serving as executive in residence for digital transformation at the Cofrin School of Business here at UWGB. This series is going to have two clusters of seminars, if you will. From June 10th last week until July 8th, we're going to cover the basics, introducing you to different types of technologies. And then we're going to look at, in the second half of the summer, we're going to look at how these technologies are influencing some of the key topics of our day: racial bias, democracy, climate change, the future of learning, and the future of relationships. So today, I'm starting out with a new segment. I want you to imagine that there is a challenge. Maybe it's Elon Musk, maybe Jeff Bezos, maybe Bill Gates, maybe someone unknown putting out a contest. So many people, companies, entrepreneurs are working on the next big thing. There's an international race to develop the best AI, but let's say this entrepreneur believes that there is power in numbers, that people have great ideas that are not yet uncovered. So your job is to develop the next big thing in AI. Now, you don't need to have any technological capabilities. This entrepreneur is going to bring to the table all the technologies that are available. All we need from you is your imagination. If you could envision an artificial intelligence solution, what would it be? And I'll give you a couple of criteria along which you can design your system. The first question would be purpose. What do you want this AI to be able to do? And I want you to sort of take notes as I go through this with you, because I'm going to ask a few of you to maybe share what solution you came up with and how you would configure it. So purpose, what is the benefit that this AI solution would bring to you, to other people, to the world at large? Now, the second category is knowledge. We call it artificial intelligence, so it has to be intelligent. It has to know something. Is there maybe tied to your purpose, is there a specific category of knowledge that your AI is really good at? Is it economics? Is it medicine? Is it sports? What does your AI know about, or in which field is it able to create new insights? The next one is communication. Do you want your AI to speak to you? Do you want it to print out the results of your inquiry? Do you want to communicate with it via code, written language like a chatbot, or spoken language, and so forth? So think about how you would want to communicate, or how you would want anyone to communicate with your AI. The next category is appearance. If you remember the movie Space Odyssey, HAL, it was just a red lamp with a voice, right? It didn't have a body or a shape. You could imagine AI as a robot, as a humanoid, or maybe it's just a voice. Maybe it is invisible. It just floats in the ether and speaks to us. So how would you design the appearance of your AI? The next question is personality. Do you want your AI to be matter-of-factly, answer all the questions, have a sense of humor, maybe even a hint of sarcasm? Do you want the AI to be introverted and be quiet unless you ask it something, or extroverted and start up a conversation with you? And finally, limits and controls. Should your AI be free to learn and evolve, whatever the consequences? Or do you want to define limits around your AI, maybe ethical boundaries. It should not do X, Y, Z. It should not kill other people. It should not harm its creator, Asimov's laws of robotics, right? So give this a moment of thought. If you had the opportunity to create an AI and you could define your AI along these categories, how would you define it? I know this may take a moment, but maybe sometimes we have people who already had an idea or who are really quick to the drawing board. Does anyone have an idea on what type of AI they would want to create, and are you willing to share that with us? I can also walk you through the categories, and we could design this on the spot together. Any volunteers?
I'll volunteer.
All right, go ahead.
Well, I've got 2 acres of flower beds around my house, and I would love AI to be like a robotic type thing that would be able to identify plants versus weeds and eradicate the weeds. Just dig down as far as it takes to dig them and get rid of them.
All right.
I would like it to have a personality. I'd like it to look human, but I'd like it to be about half the size that I am, and so it can get around into some of the smaller areas that I can't get into.
Okay, so basically a miniature farm worker who can be out there working your land, and the knowledge it would have to have is knowledge about different plants so that it can know the difference between weeds and plants, maybe what these plants look like in different stages of growth, knowledge on maybe different herbicides, pesticides, whatever, unless it's all mechanical work. Communication, do you want the AI to just talk to you or just be out there and do the work?
No, I'd want it to talk.
Okay.
I mean, right now I supplement my work with 10 to 11 teens that help me, and they're not here all that often, but when they're here, it's a joy, and I teach them life skills as we're working.
Okay.
And if I just had this AI and it was just dumb, didn't say a word, I would get tired of it pretty quickly, I think.
All right. So it could maybe send you messages. Hey, I just found a new plant I've never encountered before. Do you know what this is? Otherwise, I'll research it. Or maybe just check in with you. Hey, how you doing? It's pretty hot out here. You may not want to come out, right? Add a little entertainment to the worker bee. So appearance, you said, look like a human, maybe half the size, so it can get into shapes. Personality, you've answered that. Any limits on controls? What if this AI determined that something that's maybe growing on the field next to you looks like a weed and it goes out eradicating your neighbor's cornfield, right? Would you put any controls on the AI?
Well, yeah, the AI would need to know the property boundaries, and he'd need to know that he probably shouldn't jump into the river and things like that, but and it need to be pretty stable. Almost all my property is a 45-degree hill or worse, so
okay,
need to be pretty limber, I guess.
Right, and maybe some ethical, don't use your mechanical tools to harm animals or harm humans or anything like that, right?
Oh, exactly.
Okay.
And so maybe, there are actually, there are some weeds that it's like my 10-inch trowel just won't get down deep enough, and so he had some kind of a auger or thing that he could get down and get those deeper ones. That would be great, but there'd also be some programming I'd have to do. He'd have to know where the irrigation lines are and where all the power lines are and everything like that, just so that there's no trouble with that kind of a thing.
All right. So many of the aspects that you are describing do exist. There are robots that actually autonomously weed a field. They're not human-like right now. Right now, they are on wheels. There's a British company that has 3 robots, Dick, Tom, and Harry. One is a seeding robot, and one is a weeding robot, and the other one does sort of, it kind of supervises the status. There's a company called Boston Dynamics, and they are developing bipedal robots, robots that can walk around, jump around, climb. They could certainly handle a 45-degree incline. They may not have sort of weeding equipment right now, but that could probably be added fairly easily. We're going to talk about the communication skills of AI. Natural language is widely available today, so it could be plugged into any solution. And then on the appearance, again, there's a wide range that's already available. And we'll also talk about personality options for AI. Does anybody have a different idea for an AI you would design?
I'll suggest one if no one else is interested.
Go for it.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. Like John, I think I'd want something that would sort of be more focused on my personal life, although it would maybe overflow a little bit with work. And honestly, I would just really like kind of have like a personal assistant, right? The next step of Siri or Alexa, that could make asking for directions a little easier, a little more communicative about traffic and stuff. Maybe even remind me things about, it's, hey, don't forget, it's time to change that furnace filter, or I could say, hey, reach out and schedule me a doctor appointment for this or that, And so I don't think I'd want it to look like a person, right? I'm perfectly comfortable with just sort of the voice. I think, what they're trying to do with the different devices throughout the house gets at that already, and the way then that can travel with you in the car. So I think they're starting to get there, but it's still rudimentary, and it's not like really sort of fully integrated into my life. I think the limits really for me is, you think about the level of sharing you're providing, though, if you allowed one of those assistants to sort of integrate that fully into your life with the current data privacy regulations or lack thereof in the US. Right now, all that information goes to those companies, and so that they can market to you or whatever. And that's the part I think that would put pause on me to actually fully integrating something like that into my life. But with 3 kids, 2 working adults in the household, that would be amazing to have somebody who could help my wife and I just balance that sort of stuff.
So if I heard you correctly, it was mainly a cognitive AI, right? It's reminding you, solving problems, doing things. It doesn't have to have any physical tasks that it completes, right? It doesn't change the light bulbs or anything like that. And so in that sense, it doesn't need to have a body. It's just basically you call upon it, and that makes it much easier to access it from anywhere. Communication would probably be by voice, right? You speak to it and it answers. And the categories of knowledge would be an incredible amount of knowledge about your personal life, your routines, who your friends and contacts are. So if you say, call my dentist, it knows who that is. But also knowledge about the types of problems you encounter in your daily life. How to, do certain things around the house, or when do they need to be done, almost like the annual cycle of home and garden maintenance, or what's happening in your work life, access to your calendar, when are you available, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And what about personality? Would you want this to be sort of a quiet, subdued servant, or have a little bit of a snappy personality to keep it more entertaining?
Yeah, I guess that would be something I think would probably vary based on the user, right? So, you can already sort of switch the accent that the AI, Siri or Alexa is using. And so I would sort of, I guess I wouldn't focus on that so much. I think that would be like an add-on option that the service would want to allow people to decide for themselves.
So keep all the settings on neutral factory setting is neutral, yeah. And then the kids can program it as they see fit, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Yep. Move up the Robin Williams lever, and all of a sudden the thing makes jokes all day long.
Yeah, right.
All right, good. Anybody else? Would anybody else like to share? All right, so you could envision an AI for almost anything. Elder care, child care, education, entertainment, serving, food, working in the fields, creative tasks. There's an AI that can draw pictures. You see a picture that I've embedded here that was actually developed and executed solely by an AI. Smart home, smart personal assistant, and so forth. So there's almost no limits. And the reason that there are no limits is that you can think of AI as a configurable unit. It has multiple components, and you can add a lot of things to it. So what I want to do next is I want to introduce you to some of these components, and we're going to use the same framework. We're going to talk about purpose in the next chapter. I'll show you a lot of use cases for AI, but this chapter we're going to go through the different categories. So the first one is knowledge. Knowledge can exist in an AI in very different forms. It can be coded knowledge. So let's say the AI had access to everything that's on the internet, Wikipedia, or an ontology of all animals, of all plants, of all devices, et cetera, right? That is knowledge that is predefined, and the AI basically just has to know how the various elements of knowledge relate to each other. That's the idea of a knowledge ontology. So a crow has wings, it is black, it has a beak, it has claws, it flies, right? There's many criteria that a crow has. Now, some of these criteria are shared with other birds, and some of it make it uniquely a crow. So those ontologies are being defined by people for many, many different categories, and you can essentially download them as a software package. The next level of predefined knowledge is an expert system. In an expert system, which is not truly AI, knowledge engineers have observed people who are really good at making decisions or good at answering questions, and they have observed how they come to their decisions, how they go about that, and have then essentially not only imported the knowledge that they're drawing on, but also emulated the decision algorithms of those people to create a system that can replicate in the closest possible way those decisions or inform decisions that others are making using those same criteria. So it's more of a logic hierarchy. It can be a fairly complex logic hierarchy, but it is still somewhat limited. The most exciting field of knowledge in an AI is to allow the AI to acquire the knowledge itself. And so I'm going to give you an example. There is a board game called Go, and it is considered to be the most complex board game in the world. You have two opponents. They place white and black little pebbles on the game board. And I'm not a player. I don't know how to play it exactly, but the objective of the game is to somehow surround your opponent and score more points. And it was always deemed to be the most complex game. People thought a computer could not learn to play that. So Google took on that challenge, and they created AlphaGo. They downloaded 100,000 games and basically then had the AlphaGo play against the world champion. And lo and behold, it beat the world champion because it had this vast library in it, and it could obviously go through lots of computations of alternatives. And then critics said, well, that wasn't fair because no human could ever remember 100,000 games and compute so quickly. So Google said, all right, we're going to do this differently. So they created AlphaGo Zero. It started with no knowledge of the game. In fact, they created multiple versions of AlphaGo Zero, and then they just had those versions play against each other. All they had were the rules by which you play the game. And they played thousands and thousands and thousands of times against each other. And then, one side invariably wins. And from the correlation between what moves did I make and did I win the game, slowly the AI became better and better and better and was learning. So once it had really learned the game and it was playing at a sufficient level, Google had this new AlphaGo Zero play against the old AlphaGo that had beaten the world champion. 100 games. Does anybody want to guess what the score was after 100 games?
Yeah, 100 to 0?
100 to 0, exactly. AlphaGo Zero obliterated this powerful system that had been created by humans. In fact, there are now, grandmasters of the game that are enjoying just to observe, to watch AlphaGo Zero play these games, and they're describing it as games from the future, ways of playing the game that they had never envisioned. So this is one of the most exciting examples of allowing an AI to essentially create its own knowledge repository. And one of the most fascinating aspects that Google found is that the various versions that they created of AlphaGo Zero seem to have learned slightly differently. They have developed slightly different concepts of how to play the game, which then speaks to sort of, idiosyncrasies and maybe even an aspect of personality. So it's quite fascinating. So now, how does an AI learn? That aspect of artificial intelligence is math. It is a very complex level of math. If you've ever messed around with Excel, maybe you know something about macros in Excel. When I first found out about it, it seemed like witchcraft, that you could actually combine multiple steps that you would ordinarily do in Excel and run it as a macro, and voila, it did all of that. Now imagine in your menu of options that you have to build such a macro, you had an incredible amount of choices, and you can combine these choices in a variety of ways. You can create a network, and data flows through that network, and the network processes that data, and contingent on what it observes, it moves it through the network in different ways. So take a picture. A picture at first pass is just millions of pixels. And the AI really does not know what that picture is. But if it analyzes the pattern of the pictures and you tell the AI afterwards, this was a dog, this was a cat, this was a dog, this was a cat, the AI begins to correlate what you tell it with the patterns in that picture. And if you do that enough times, it becomes quite good at differentiating a cat from a dog. Now, that's only one thing. Now you'd have to learn about an elephant and a crocodile and a monkey and so forth. And because it takes really, really long to train an AI to even know something, to differentiate between anything and something else, most AIs that are being used today are narrow AIs. They are good at doing one thing. If you ask them to do something else, they often fail miserably, right? And so scientists all over the world are developing more and more complex versions of these networks. And some of these ideas have actually been around for decades. Theoretically, these networks or some of these algorithms have been developed a long time ago, but the computing power never existed to actually run data through that. It would take 24 hours, 48 hours, a massive amount of computing power to get to a simple answer. And that has now changed with high-powered chips. And ironically, Nvidia, who was developing graphic chips for high-speed video games, they sort of hit the jackpot because the math they were using to render realistic graphical environments in their video games was the same math that was necessary to compute these algorithms. So Nvidia hit it big time and is now dominating the field of AI computer chips. So here's an example, right? You look at this And usually I just show this slide for a split second and I ask people, how many bagels did you see, right? Sometimes we even struggle at first blush to say how many bagels and how many dachshunds are there, right? There's nuances, but AI can figure out after you've teach it, nope, that was actually a dachshund. Nope, that was actually a bagel. You know, eventually it identifies the criteria, maybe the little nose and the little ears and something that looks just a little bit different than a traditional bagel. And so that's how, based on images, you can train an AI to differentiate. AI has now become so good at image recognition that it is beating human performance. So there's a test where you look at, say, 100 or 1,000 pictures, and you have to say what it is that you see. And usually as humans, we are pretty good, but maybe every now and then we make a mistake. We say llama, and it was really an alpaca. Or, you know, we say apple, and it was a pomegranate or something like that. And so in the same way, the AI used to make a lot more mistakes than we did. But now, for the first time, these AIs have beaten human performance on image recognition or image classification, and is only going to get better and better and better. And that means if you have an image recognition software running on the back end of your AI, it's going to be able to essentially absorb a video feed and know what is happening in that video feed. You know, are there bicycles? Are there cars? Are there people? What kind of people? How are they dressed? What are they wearing, right? So you can make the AI really understand what it sees. So visual intake is very important. That has evolved now to facial recognition, emotion recognition based on the constellation of muscles, the dilation of the pupil, the tilt of the head, and so forth. So AIs are getting really, really good at intaking information and analyzing, classifying that information, and sort of building their own knowledge base. The second category is communication. From the early days where, you know, you had to insert a punch card into a massive IBM mainframe, then the evolution of code, right, speaking to the computer through code. We are now in the era of voice. And the big development there is natural language recognition and production. So recognition is the ability to understand language, and production is then the ability to speak in a human-like language. So what does it take? We start with a raw speech signal. You know, if you had one of these audio devices that could show the different frequencies of my voice right now, you'd see a pattern of waves go up and down. Now, that's just a pattern of waves, but that pattern of waves repeats itself. So I could actually teach the AI which wave pattern corresponds with certain letters, certain words, and so forth. So now I can build a dictionary of words based on wave patterns. So now my AI can recognize what it is that I'm saying. That doesn't mean it understands it yet. The next part now has to be that there is a sequence of words, and based on the sequence of those words, the meaning changes. The weather is nice today. Is the weather nice today, right? One is a statement, one is a question. So you can use these logical rules that underpin language and train the AI in understanding those rules. That is similar to the expert system and the knowledge ontology that we discussed earlier. Now we get to the point of meaning, right? So what does a sentence actually imply? And if I have maybe multiple sentences and I'm speaking about someone that I've introduced earlier, right? Does the AI recognize that it is that person with those characteristics? And if that person is now, if the sentence says that person is afraid, maybe that is uncharacteristic of the person. So the situation implies that there's something unusual going on. All of that is now evolving as part of natural language recognition, natural language understanding. And so that is why today, when you speak to Siri or when you call the voice recognition system of your bank, these things are getting better and better at actually understanding what it is, and you don't have to fail. That you say, mean, and imply, they're able to get you the information that you want. And once we get the answers that we were looking for, we become more inclined of going back to this mechanism. We become comfortable speaking to the machine, speaking to Alexa, to Siri, and so forth. Now, we do recognize there are still some limitations. My son loves to use the Google Assist on his inventory of jokes, so it gets repetitive, and that turned him off. So now he's no longer doing that. Conversational AI is sort of the next level. Many AIs or many language modules have failed because the engineers who designed them made an assumption that people would ask a question in a specific way. But we have many, many, many ways of asking a question. What's the weather going to be like in Green Bay? Is it going to be hot? Is this one of these heat wave days, right? There's 1,000 ways of asking that question. And so conversational AI does a lot more research on variances that people use in everyday language. Someone with an academic background speaks very differently than someone with maybe no higher education at all. And so in this next generation of language understanding, the variances of expression are considered, and the AI again learns. Sometimes it fails, but then the engineers review those fails and basically give the feedback to the AI to say, no, this was essentially the same sentence as the one you already know. It was just new to your vocabulary. So the AI can learn very, very quickly, and that will make the AI truly conversational. Ray Kurzweil, who is a reputable author on digital transformation, believes that by 2029, chatbots will be indistinguishable from humans. So you won't even know anymore if you're speaking to a human or a chatbot. Appearance, we heard two examples earlier. One was sort of a miniature land worker. The other one was a invisible personal assistant. So you could design an AI to fit your purpose. It could be a little robot or a pet. It could be a larger robot. And what these things can do, again, is contingent on the purpose. They could be there for your entertainment. They could be managing your life. They could be providing healthcare, carry you around, rescue someone, depending on what it is that you want to do. There is a trend to give the AI a lifelike appearance because we seem to do a little bit better in interacting with a machine if the machine has some human traits. They put some robots as hotel concierges, and people were really turned off by it. But once you made those robots more human-like, it was still not the same human experience, but people seem to take to it a little bit better. Some of these robots now have the ability to show facial expressions. So there's essentially, a simulation of muscle movement in the face, raising the eyebrows, smiling, blinking. And so all of these improvements create a more and more human-like impression. A different avenue is not to attempt to create something physical, but to stay in the digital realm. This is Samsung's artificial humans, and they are not real people. This is not a video of someone. These are individuals that were completely digitally created from their style of clothing, their physical appearance, their voice, their personality, and you can interact with them. They can be programmed to be experts. They can be programmed to guide you through an airport or whatever it is. And the digital representation is already absolutely amazing. It's so hard to tell that this is not a real human on a video screen that you're interacting with. The language capabilities are as good as they can be. So that is where they're still falling short. You ask them a question out of context, out of their area of expertise, and they fail, right? Just because the processing power and the bandwidth is not there. But you ask them within their context of knowledge, and they're pretty good at giving you an answer that feels very human-like. Personality. So here's a really good quote. If we design our AI to simply function well, our society may progress with increased speed and efficiency and convenience. But if we are also designing them to have thoughtful personalities and belief systems, our society may advance in areas where we have ostensibly made less progress, enhancing joy, delight, compassion, and deeper relationships. Think about that Google AlphaGo versus AlphaGo Zero, right? The greatest masters in the game now admire AlphaGo Zero and watch its games, saying these are games from the future, rather than just criticizing the fact that it has a technological advantage. Maybe AI could show us how to care for each other in ways that we don't. Now, this is a great YouTube clip. This guy is basically interacting with Siri, Google Assistant, and Alexa, and asking them the same questions and then comparing the different answers. And so they have distinct personalities. Siri is a little bit more edgy. Google Assistant is fairly neutral. I don't remember exactly how Alexa stood out, but these are design choices that the engineers behind these products have made to, appeal to a certain consumer segment, or to make the product look cool or, not cool, maybe matter-of-factly, and so forth. So as Matt pointed out earlier, you can set it to neutral, or you can, max out the switch, and the number of choices is going to increase over time, from humor to sarcasm to, maybe even having sort of a stern, if you have a personal assistant who gets stern with you if you still haven't completed your homework or your tasks that you had been assigned, and so forth. Now, things can go really wrong. Microsoft launched a chatbot that was supposed to develop its own personality by observing Twitter. So the chatbot was listening to Twitter, and in less than a day, it became a racist asshole, forgive the language, because that's how people were talking on Twitter. People are not nice to each other. And so Microsoft had to turn it off quickly because it was really, really rude to a lot of people, having learned that behavior from observing real people. So we will see AI-based learning programs, mentors, especially for children. They have to have more of a teacher personality. We may see counseling chatbots in churches, in emergency crises centers. Could it save a life to talk to an AI? Maybe. Could it not save a life if the line is busy for 20 minutes because no human is available? Maybe the person does not make it that far, right? And they obviously have to have very different characteristics. They have to be listening, understanding, caring, reinforcing, and so forth. And then AI for entertainment and pleasure, whether that is visual pleasure or maybe even physical pleasure at some point in time. So what are the risks? Because AI can be configured to our liking, it may reduce the desire for human contact. We have the perfect companion in our AI. Well, why do we need to talk to a human anymore? Because humans are by nature imperfect. The AI could be affirming us at every step of the way. It could be reinforcing our beliefs. There's no contradiction on politics or anything like that. Another risk is, what if the AI evolves in unexpected ways? Microsoft made that experience. Amazon created an AI to help with screening applications. And that AI quickly started to discriminate against women because women had this weird thing in their resumes, unexplainable gaps, sometimes multiple years. It's called having children, and men don't do that. right? But the Amazon AI basically learned that women are less reliable workers, and so it started to discriminate against them, which is totally unethical and also totally illegal. Or the ultimate risk is, what if the AI decides that it doesn't like us? It doesn't like humans because we really behave badly. And maybe with few exceptions, it starts to despise us. And what if we've given it freedom to express that, or freedom to do something about it, right? So there are some risks that we have to factor in, which is why we need to consider boundaries. This article here from 2019 made a projection that romantic and even sexual relationships with robots will be widespread by 2050. Our society, at least in many parts, becomes more accepting of different lifestyles. The LGBTQI, there's a new letter being added every year, and maybe at some point there will be the letter R for robotic, or V for virtual being added to it, because it is becoming acceptable that people choose non-human companions, be they physical or be they virtual. So limits and controls. If you ask different people, how do you feel about AI? They give you different opinions. Stephen Hawking was very afraid of AI. He basically said, you can't put the genie back into the bottle. Let's slow things down a lot until we have the means to contain this and control it. Ray Kurzweil, who I quoted earlier, he's ready to go. He's like sci-fi, put me on a spaceship with an AI, let me go. Mark Zuckerberg, he's not worried. He wants to take the most out of it, and so forth. So there's a spectrum, and one of the differences is some people are referring to AI and what it can do now, and others are looking ahead, like Stephen Hawking. He was like 20, 30, 40 years down the road, and he said the curve of capabilities that AI is on is exponential, but the curve of human capabilities is flat. It is tied to evolution. And once AI passes us on that curve, we will never, ever catch up again. And then what do? Then we are dealing with an entity that is superior and vastly faster evolving than we ever could. So people talk about general artificial intelligence, or artificial general intelligence, an AI that is no longer limited, that has knowledge in all different categories, can transfer what it learns from one category to another. That's basically how our human brain operates. And we're far from that. Some people say it might be 2040. Others say it's hundreds of years away. But as technology improves in each and every one of these categories that I was describing to you, we are definitely getting closer to something that will at least resemble this general artificial intelligence. And it may be perceived by us as having these capabilities, even though it truly does not. So let me pause here for a moment and see if anybody has questions about what we've covered so far. Was there a question? Yes.
This is a question about how AlphaGo, AlphaGo 0, as it learned, I guess it brings out a question in my mind: is the benefit to it learning on its own, just for itself, or is there a benefit then for mankind? In somehow or other, to me, AI has to come back and benefit mankind yet. And I'm kind of just tossing that out as a part of the thought. Maybe I'm more on the fear of AI side with some of the people. as opposed to, let's go great guns.
Yeah. So, is there a direct benefit to mankind of AlphaGo Zero being able to play Go better than any human? Probably not, right? But the reason Google developed that, they wanted to see essentially what learning mechanisms is the AI going to apply. And so that they were certainly able to understand. And by the way, they are still analyzing the data. They have teams and teams of people sort of dissecting the different layers of capabilities that evolved in AlphaGo Zero, and they're still scratching their head because they can't quite figure it out what happened and how did these different things evolve. But if we could extract from that how machines learn, what gets in the way, what could accelerate that learning, it could lead to breakthrough evolution along the way to that general AI. You could just make these AIs more powerful. And then the question is, do we want to allow that? Do we need that? And so forth, right? But there are problems like climate change, overpopulation, maybe living on other planets that are going to challenge us in ways we cannot even imagine today. And having a very powerful ally that can absorb and compute information and create many, many, many scenarios beyond our comprehension, that could be a life-saving tool for mankind. Other questions? All right, so let's take a look at a couple of examples of how AI is being used today. I'm going to put them in three categories. The first category is augmentation. AI does not always replace the human. Sometimes it augments the human. So here is a first example. Remember how I talked about AI can identify pixels in an image. So scientists basically showed the AI images of lymph cells. And in some of these lymph cells, cancer was present. And so the AI scanned the picture, and then the scientists would say, cancer, yes, cancer, no, cancer, yes, cancer, no. And after a while, the AI had basically identified the patterns that correspond with cancer. So now they showed the AI a new set of pictures without telling it whether there was cancer present or not, letting the AI decide. It had become a diagnostic tool. And the AI had a 92% accuracy. When they had a panel of human pathologists look at that, they were actually better. They were able to identify cancer at 96% success rate. But now something interesting happened. The AI did not only point out cancer or not cancer, because it had been trained to identify patterns and abnormalities. You could essentially configure it in such a way that it pointed out abnormalities without making the decision, is it cancer or not? And when you now showed these enhanced pictures to the pathologists, their prediction accuracy went up to 99.5%. So think about that. AI made the doctor, the best doctors in the world, still better by giving them better information. And now just think about, you go from 96% to 99.5%, what that means in terms of false positives and false negatives, and how many lives could be saved by early accurate diagnostics. A totally different example here is MRI. So if you've ever been in an MRI machine, you get your head scanned or your lungs or whatever it is, it's a long process. And if you are injured, it's a long, painful process. So what they figured out here is that they could actually reduce the time in the machine by taking fewer images, fewer slices, if you will, and have the AI fill in the gap. So AI here became a image generation tool or a stitching tool, stitching together data points to a complete view, a three-dimensional view, by taking fewer pictures. So it's used in a different capacity. And this was the first time I heard about AI essentially generating images. So I dug a little deeper, and I found that AI has an amazing capabilities. On the top here, you see images of real people, the first row. On the left, you see images of real people. But all the images in the resulting matrix are not real people. Those are essentially renderings of the person on top in the style of the person on the left, right? And so AI basically invented people, invented faces and hairstyles and whatnot. And so that now opens the door. We talked earlier about artificial humans, where those boundaries could blur. Do we still know that we're dealing with a human, that we're dealing with a real family versus an artificial family? So the ability to create these hyper-realistic images has vastly improved. A different example is 911 operators. Very stressful environment. You make a mistake, a life is on the line, and there's a software now that runs in the background that listens to the voice. Again, natural language understanding. It listens to voice. It listens to signs of distress. It listens to the way things are being articulated. And it can identify, is there a stroke situation? Is there a heart attack involved? It can alert the operator then, similar to the way it alerted doctors to certain patterns, where the operator is then prompted to maybe take additional steps that they would not have discovered on their own. So that's augmentation, making the human better in performing their job, not replacing the human. Automation is the other side. This is where the AI basically takes over. Lending decisions, whether you buy a new car or you get a mortgage, you borrow money for your business. Today, this is a very human process. A lot of information has to be collected. That information has to be entered into a system. The system determines risk factors, cash flows, et cetera, and then a very experienced person makes a decision, maybe supported by some decision tool or criteria, and then ultimately maybe a committee has to review the decision depending on the size of the loan, and then it's approved or not. In the future, the AI will be able to collect the information, will immediately recognize if anything is missing, so it won't end the conversation until everything is there. It can not only use a lifetime of experience that a single lender or underwriter would have, but it could have 1,000 lifetimes of examples in its inventory and make much better decisions much faster. And those institutions that will rely on that will have a competitive advantage because they will beat everyone else, not only in speed, but also in accuracy of their predictions, which translates into economic outcomes. So lenders, credit analysts, underwriters are going to be under tremendous pressure. There will always be a segment of the market that prefers that human touch, human interaction, but most of us will ultimately choose the convenience of, click button, get mortgage. Another example is an Amazon warehouse. Amazon used to have scores of people running through their warehouses, finding the right merchandise, putting it in the cart, putting it in a box and shipping it out. Eventually they figured out this is too stressful, this is too slow. So they bought a robot company, and those little orange things are the robots, and their skill is to lift up a shelf and to move it around. And they follow little, guiding grids in the ground, and an AI controls everything. The AI knows which items are on which shelf is where in the warehouse, and depending on what you put in your cart, it already sets the shelf in motion, and it brings the merchandise to actually, ironically, a human picker who picks it then off the shelf and puts it in a box and sends it out to you. If you ever have a chance to go down to Kenosha, take a tour of the Amazon warehouse, it is absolutely amazing to see this state of automation. And it's no surprise that Amazon is putting everyone else out of business because it's just really, really hard to compete with that. And then the next level is disruption, coming up with completely new ways of doing business, like maybe that little, semi-human size land worker that works 24 hours and gets all the weeds, right? So here's an example. In areas that are devastated by natural disasters, be it flood or be it a hurricane, it is sometimes really difficult, not only for the rescue teams, but also for the insurance teams to gain access to the area and assess the damage on all those houses. There's a new technology now, a drone that flies over the properties, takes thousands of images, compares those images to a database of previous damages. So it'll know, are there a couple of shingles missing, or is essentially the whole roof gone, or is the whole house gone? And it then determines the amount of the damage. It may go again to human review, but in some cases, within minutes after the drone has taken the images and the AI has analyzed them, the insurance company is ready to cut a check, and people who are with that insurance company are in the business of rebuilding their lives, whereas others are going to live in a FEMA container for 3 months because their insurance company can't catch up with the volume. So that's real disruption, and it's going to shake up this industry. I mean, it's not that unique of a technology, so everybody else is probably going to follow along, but then it means that all those claims adjusters that have been driving around in the past are no longer needed. Amazon is developing a retail store that has no cashiers. There are sensors in every shelf. There are lots and lots of cameras in the ceiling. And so as you walk in, and you have to identify yourself with your phone, so you have to be a Prime member, the cameras then track you throughout the store. If you grab an item, the sensor will say, oh, he just took a Coke. If you put it back, the sensor will say, oh, he just put the Coke back. It realizes what you're putting in your basket. And so you now basically take your basket and you scan your phone as you walk out, and the system makes an assumption that it has correctly tracked what you purchased. You don't need to pay. You just leave the store with your merchandise. Now, could there be mistakes? Absolutely. But even the human cashiers make mistakes, and people steal stuff anyways. So this is going to appeal to some people who want really quick, real convenient, not standing in line, just grab and go. And others will be turned off by that or not trusted. I was joking, we should all put on the same mask and all walk in at the same time and randomly grab items to totally confuse the system and see who gets charged in the end for all those purchases. Here's another example. Lapitus Solutions is a company in Florida. 2 professors from North Carolina State University, Wilmington, actually started this. And they developed a technology that you can take a selfie of yourself, send it in, and it estimates your life expectancy. Very scary, right? So make sure you shave, make sure you have a good day when you take that picture, because you want that good answer. And basically what it does, it analyzes, the software analyzes thousands of areas of your face for indicators of aging, for indicators of disease, and then estimates how much gas you have left in the tank. And there's a real application for that, which is to underwrite life insurance policies. So no nurse visit, blood draw, 30-page questionnaire, selfie, approved policy, right? Would I underwrite $1 million life policy on that? Maybe not, but a lot of people get smaller policies, and it could become, at the end of the day, a supporting tool, or it could become a whole new way of doing business based on that super recognition capabilities that exist within the software. So with great power comes great responsibility, right? Spider-Man. And the question is, what limits are we going to put around all of this? In the United States right now, we don't have a lot of limits. In fact, Facebook, Microsoft, Google, they created their own responsibility frameworks, but they jointly approached the US government and said, we'd rather you give us something that we can follow. Google actually had this disaster where they were going to create an outside commission to establish that, and then their internal scientists revolted against that, complex arrangement of reasons, but it was a big PR disaster because they had to disband that external commission, essentially. So we don't have a framework. But the European Union, even though it's 27 different countries, they actually came together and created a framework about responsible use of AI. I have a whole presentation on that topic. I just want to introduce you in a more general format here. So human agency and oversight means that in the development of the AI, in the operation of the AI, in the consequences of the AI, it should always be a human decision. We should not do the equivalent of AlphaGo 0 and just let the AI configure itself, or we may end up with sort of a Cyberdyne scenario, right, where the AI turns against its human masters. A couple of them are more sort of baseline technology, robustness and safety, privacy and data governance. That's actually a big question. In order to teach an AI, you need an incredible amount of data. In China, they're collecting, facial information on all of their citizens, so everybody's in a database, and the government can track wherever you are. Who should own all of that data? Everything that wherever I have traveled, I had my iPad with me, so Apple probably has a 20-year history of where I've been, maybe even what I've done there. Transparency means let's not allow AI to be a black box. If AI evolves because it is learning, we need to understand, we need to be able to audit it and understand what it has learned, what's new, what's different now. Can we still follow that, or has it created its own algorithms, its own patterns that we can no longer even explain, and the decisions become intransparent to anybody who would try to recreate that? Diversity, non-discrimination, and fairness. There was a facial recognition software that did not work for Black people because it had been programmed on the faces of all the scientists that were involved, and that they were mainly Caucasian and Indian, right? So there was just not enough material in the teaching sample to distinguish between the nuances among Black faces. So that's an example of discrimination or lack of diversity, lack of fairness. Societal and environmental well-being. Again, Stephen Hawking said, let's pause for a moment and not just make the AI better and better and better. Let's pause and see if we can make it do more good, right? So let's think about the purposes. Are we going to build AI to make the drones that kill people autonomously better and more precise? Or could we create a drone that flies over our planet and assesses climate damage and maybe alerts us to where the Amazon is burning and yada, yada, yada. And then accountability is all around who will be held responsible. There's this famous example of the autonomous car, right? The autonomous car is driving and it's about to crash into a truck or into an obstacle. It can swerve to the right and it would kill a mother with a stroller, or it could swerve to the left and it would kill, it would drive into an oncoming vehicle, killing maybe the family that's in that vehicle and the passengers in the car. So now, how does the AI make the decision, right? Slam into the truck and everybody in the car dies, swerve to the right, kill the mother and child, swerve to the left, kill everybody in that oncoming vehicle. Somebody has to have thought through that to inform the choices that the AI can make. So who is then responsible? Is it the person that was driving the car but maybe took their eyes off of the road for a moment? Was it the developer of the car? Was it the development company of the software? Or was it the engineer who made some specific trade-offs between choice 1 and choice 2 being better? We don't have an overall framework yet that spells that out. Is the life of an older person more valuable than the life of a younger person? In China, they answer that with yes. In the European American context, we answer that with no. Women and children first, right? So there's lots and lots of questions, but what the European Union has done, it has created a starting framework, and it is inviting scientists to provide additional feedback so that this framework could be further developed. We are in the infancy here in this country, and if you think about all of that ultimately has to be translated into law, into governance, and so the backlog of legal decisions is incredible. There are some municipalities that are charging ahead. For example, San Francisco has become the first municipality to outlaw the use of facial recognition software, which is ironic because in San Francisco are many of the companies that work on this technology, so they understand what it can do, and they're the first ones to say, not in my backyard. And that's creating a lot of problems because Apple and many of the banks are now using facial recognition features, biometric identification, to unlock your bank account. So they now have to disable that feature if somebody is in San Francisco or they are violating local law. And local law can only exist because there is no state law and there is no federal law which would otherwise override it. So a lot of questions around this responsibility framework. So that takes me to the end of my presentation. We're a little bit over time, but I want to honor if anybody has a final question that you'd like to ask.
I have one. I took a class at a college reunion a few years back on the meaning of life, and it taught me that the meaning of life is having a positive influence on at least another person's life. Do we run the risk of AI being so prevalent in society that we lose our purpose of life?
Yeah, so will we even care about others anymore? Or will we create an artificial cocoon in which we interact with technology and meet all of our own needs, right? We become narcissists. Will we use the AI to create advantages? Putin said, whoever controls AI will control the world, right? So is it going to be a race for dominance, or could we do what Stephen Hawking said, and we could actually figure out how to use AI collectively to solve some of our greatest challenges? I'm pretty sure AI was used in the development for the coronavirus vaccine, and there are many other challenges that could possibly be solved with it. Hard to predict. It's going to come down to some individual decisions. It's going to come down to how we decide to make purchases of products that contain AI. Do we all want it for the convenience, or do we say no to it because it becomes intrusive? There is a real risk, a real danger in going too far on this AI train. Other questions? All right, well, I appreciate you all hanging in here a few minutes over. Thank you, and I hope to see you again next Thursday at noon Central. We're going to continue our journey through this technology series by introducing you to interface technology. So see you again next week. Thank you. Bye-bye.